One is just in terms of just being very rigorous. I'd say in law school, there's a lot of emphasis placed on making sure when you do your research, you're citing sources properly, making sure that when you are taking something from like different, pieces of like law, that you are actually getting the point of the case accurately. So I think early on that taught me how to be rigorous and to make sure that when I'm doing any piece of work, I'm always making sure everything is like right. Two is I'd say it helped me out in becoming a more structured thinker. Law school really hones it in you and trains you how to best present arguments in a way that really helps people understand your point. Like I still remember a framework they used in school where they called it CRUPAC, which is like conclusion, rule, proof, and then application, and then conclusion. And like when you had to like write your essays, like follow that specific structure. And I think it also made me a clearer writer, because one of the things that they try to instill is really like how do you write in plain English in a way that people understand what you're saying. And then I guess the last one is just like being able to like think fast on your feet. So when I was in law school, I participated in this thing called moots, which is like fake court of appeal sessions. And you were basically given like a fact pattern. You had to like research one side and like argue it in front of a fake judge. And they would ask you questions and ask you and challenge you basically in your argumentation. And so you just had to like be able to like think quickly on your feet and like think about how to like address those points, which I would say helps later on in business meetings.
Interesting. Yeah, I like Jen's comment here. At least in the US, I don't think I've ever come across lawyers who write in plain English. So maybe there's something better about the British system. And another story you shared with me. So after school, you went on to Bain, and then from Bain, went on to Stripe. And maybe you could share a bit about that story, because I know in the middle there's something to do with a restaurant in Myanmar, and just kind of the story of how you wound up at Stripe, because I think it touches on a couple themes of RenCo, of personal connections and a bit of randomness in there too.
Yeah. So I'll go from the how did I go to law school and not end up as a lawyer and end up as a consultant. I think I realized that I enjoyed the study of law, which I realize also like sounds very nerdy, and people are like, "What? You like studying law?" But like,
it's a very nerdy group, so you're
yeah. When I did a few internships at a few law firms, I realized like in practice it was very boring and very procedural, and I also felt like it would pigeonhole me too much. Like I would be too specialized in just being a lawyer and be stuck in Singapore. And so one summer I applied to a summer internship at Bain, and I was like really lucky that like I ended up getting it, and realized that like I loved the job because I liked how it allowed me to test out different things. And I think that was what made me realize like, oh, I like being in the position where there's like a lot of options I could try out wearing different hats and be in different projects. So I guess that was like the generalist in me coming out then. So I got like an offer to return back to Bain. So that's what led me to like decide to like go to Bain. And then from Bain to Stripe, consulting life was pretty stressful and not great for work-life balance, especially in Southeast Asia, because I was based in Singapore, but our clients were in Indonesia and in Thailand and in Malaysia and the Philippines. So I would, back in the day when we would travel, I would basically be on like a flight Monday morning to Jakarta, come back on like Thursday night, and then spend the weekends in Singapore, half partying with coworkers, half sleeping and recuperating. Yeah. So just like really exhausting. And then I was tired of Singapore and wanted to see something else. And Bain had this program called like an externship, where it allows you to work 6 months at a different company to gain experience, yet you're still employed by Bain and you can come back to it. So I thought it was like a no-brainer way of like getting some real world exposure. So found a connection through one of our clients at Bain, and then they put me into like this externship with like a telco that was like beginning its operations in Myanmar. And 2014 was just like a very special time in Myanmar, because that was when the sanctions had just been lifted and the country was beginning to open up. And it was a time when there were no ATMs, there were no credit cards. The cost of a SIM card back then was still like $300. Now it's like $1. There were maybe like three bars that people would go to. So it's just like a country that was just like basically felt like it was like stuck in the past 30 years ago and was now suddenly trying to like accelerate 30 years forward. And yeah, and then the expat community was very small. And that was also where I met Jesse, my husband. I think he showed up for a few RenCo events. I don't know if any of you have met him. I think Jen has. But it was also there that like I made friends with a bunch of like locals who were like repats. So they had like studied abroad, like they were Burmese, they studied abroad and then they came back. And we decided to like start a restaurant together. And funny enough, like we realized that there was a gap in the market for like very good and clean Burmese food. So like normally like the local food would just be in like small tea shops, but we wanted to like have a place that was more of a destination that people went to and could like hang out in and would have like all day breakfast and stuff. So that was like the first investment I ever made, was like being a part-time owner into this restaurant. And then it was in Myanmar that like I had a lot more time to reflect on what I wanted in life and realize that community was one of those aspects. And then it was also there that I got involved in like some of the startup work and, met some folks in like the startup community in Southeast Asia and just realized I wanted to be part of that. And so I wanted to gain more experience in startups and come to the US. So for my background, like I grew up in the Philippines and then went to school in Singapore. And as a young kid in the Philippines, I've always wanted to be in America. So after that time in Myanmar, went back to Singapore and Bain, and then just started trying to like find my way into how I could get into a startup job in the US. And so like to lead me to like the story of how I ended up at Stripe, I wish it was more like methodical and more rigorous as to like, oh my gosh, like I really want to be in like payments and yeah, like, but then the funny story is it actually was one situation of like a lot of luck on my case where
it often is.
Yeah, one of my friends at Bain knew someone who worked at Stripe, and he was looking to hire someone for the biz ops team, and he was open to chatting with me, even though I was based in Singapore, had no experience in the US, and like I was very upfront and said like I would need a visa, like I don't have any like work experience in the US, but I think maybe he saw that I had like a lot of hunger and drive, and to like put me through the interview process and went through the rounds and was able to get a job at Stripe at that point in time. And funny enough, the person who actually hired me is Brian, who is now the CEO and co-founder of Assembled. So I guess I've been able to follow him from Stripe and then now into Assembled.
Nice, very cool. So, at the time you joined Stripe, I guess it would have been, how big? Maybe 100, 200 people?
So when I interviewed, it was around 150 people or so. And then by the time I joined, there was like a gap because of visa issues. So by the time I joined, it became like 300 people. So I actually felt like I missed this like window when Stripe just basically like doubled from the time that I first interviewed.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess big in relative terms, but small in the context of where Stripe is today. So having spent 4 years there, I mean, a ton has been written and said about Stripe, but in your view, what is it that makes that company so impactful and special in terms of driving both kind of culture in the Bay Area, I feel like, but also just being a great company?
Yeah, I think the caliber of people at Stripe was just very, very top notch. And if I had to describe the other Stripes I worked with, I'd say what comes to mind is actually a description of Patrick and John, where I think they're some of the smartest people I know, very intellectually curious, yet also extremely humble. And I think it's like rare to find like that combination. I actually have a funny story about this where my first month at Stripe, so Stripe has a very big like running culture. And back then I was not very much into shape. And their office used to still be
all those years
Mission.
of partying at Bain, yeah.
Yeah. Their office was still in the Mission, and one of this rituals such as like going on like afternoon runs up to Bernal Hill. And my buddy at the time told me, don't worry, I'm like really slow too, you'll be fine. So I went along and I was like dying, like 2 miles in, just like right before the base of the hill, I was already out of breath. And then we basically climb up Folsom Street to like go up to like that steep hill all the way up to Bernal. And everyone was just like charging ahead. And I was like lagging behind. And I was almost thinking about like, oh my gosh, I just like turned back, but then I'm embarrassed. Like, they'll like see I dropped off. And then I see Patrick Carlson coming back down to like jog back up with me. And he was like really encouraging and like saying how like it's like really hard for everyone the first time, but like if you do it often enough, you like get better. Like I don't know whether I was like half mortified in that situation, but also really touched that I felt like he came back down to make sure I was like okay. He knew I was like a new stripe, and so I think when I think about like fellow stripes, it really has like that attitude where I think people aspire to be excellent and to really push the boundaries, yet is also an environment where it's very collaborative and everyone is like very humble and would like lean in there for you. And like I was like thinking a lot about some of the operating principles that we had, and I'd say it was a combination of Stripe is for optimists, which really around like being like positive and thinking anything was possible, to we haven't won yet, which is like that combination of like the humility that people had, and always feeling like we're not resting on our laurels, there's still a lot more to achieve. And then there's like move with urgency and focus, which is like, all right, we have like very ambitious goals, like let's push really hard and push ourselves as hard as we can to get there.
So the secret is cardio. Got it. One of the questions that came in the chat was, what was your first role at Stripe? And I'm also kind of curious of what your, the progression was like there, and maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so when I interviewed, I joined the BizOps team, and the BizOps team was basically like a team of business generalists for Stripe. So I can tell you like what the role I thought was going to be, and then what the role ended up being like when I joined. Because remember,
That's
there
perfect.
was like the gap, right? So when I interviewed, when the company was still about like 100 to 150 people, there was still no sales team. There was no product management team. So the BizOps team was talking to new customers. They were like closing deals. They were also like managing those accounts. And they were pretty much acting as like product managers and working with engineering on building product. When I joined later on, the BizOps team had shifted a lot more to, I guess, a little bit more like internal consulting, or really like doing special projects to like help advance the company and like do whatever was like needed to either grow the business or like be a partner to a lot of the functions that was already built out. So like my first project was basically incubating sales ops, because at that point in time they had like built a sales team, but then they needed someone to do sales ops, and so the biz ops team was just like a pool of like resources that like other functions at Stripe could tap into to help them out on specific projects.
Got it. Okay, cool. And then, over time, I think your role changed a bit. So, the 4 years you were there, so from kind of sales ops to managing a team, curious what that was like, especially as the company was growing as much as it was.
Yeah, so the first 2 years I was in the biz ops team, and across biz ops, I ended up doing like different projects to partner with different go-to-market leaders. So like I did the sales ops. Then I spent some time with the marketing team and did like marketing strategy and like growth projects for them. And then I ended up finding a home in the support ops team, where I was, I wanted that because I wanted an opportunity to be a manager and grow a team. And then I also really liked the person I would be working for. And the idea there was it is an enabler function to like help Stripe support team scale. So my team was responsible for tooling, for training and knowledge, and like all of the other things that you basically needed for a 300 person support team to like scale to like 1,000 person support team.
Got it. Okay. So actually that's a good transition to assembled, but I'm going to go to one of the chat questions here, which is, how was your experience with sales ops, and did you feel that it helped set the tone for the rest of your career? And one other question, maybe to bounce off of that came off in the chat was, what was an example of a sales ops type of project that you were working on in those early days?
Yeah. An example of sales ops project that I was working on was honestly just partnering with the head of sales and providing visibility into sales metrics. So at that point in time, Stripe was like a very big, like you had like the self-serve engine going on, and you had all of these like startups just like signing up on Stripe and starting to process volume. But like the sales team had no way of like knowing like of the deals that they close, how much of those things actually, how much like volume, like payments volume actually like resulted from them. Like it seems easy, but like from getting the infrastructure set up correctly and actually getting dashboards in place for salespeople to know how much they were actually like selling and therefore how much they should be compensated was not put in place. So one of my main projects was basically working with the data science team to help in making sure that the company could recognize the sales processing volume. And actually at that point in time, Looker was still a startup. And so one of my projects was actually like test piloting Looker to see if that would be the reporting tool of choice and setting up the first like dashboards that the sales team used. So that answers your question, like what's a project for like sales ops, and then how did it like shape my career? I'd say,
Yeah,
I think I learned a lot as to like what it would take to like run a sales team, and also just realize if you're in any role, the first thing to like really work on is like metrics, because if you can't measure things, then you don't know what to improve. And I actually found that like Stripe, the leaders who did well were the ones who could like quickly get a handle on the metrics, start reporting on those things, and understand the drivers. So I feel like that's something that's carried on with me even now at like Assembled, even though we're like still pretty small. I think I early on like really wanted to just make sure I understood, all right, what's our revenue, where are the drivers coming from, and how do we iterate on these things.
I see. Yeah, I guess one other question that's kind of indirectly coming in the chat is, any insight into maybe what made you decide to go down kind of sales ops and then support ops rather than say, sticking in a very general biz ops or trying to get into product or partnerships, any, or was it just random, always possible?
I think I was trying to find a home to specialize in while I was at Stripe. Like I knew I was coming as like a generalist, but like kind of like I guess felt that like for me to progress in my career, I did need to pick a few areas that I would want to like gain more experience in. And in terms of like why I went down the path of support ops instead of product, I actually spent a long time like deciding, do I want to be a product manager or like actually be more on like the business side and gain in a management role. I think I realized like on the product side, like if I went down that path, it would be because I was doing it for prestige and status, because it seemed like everyone is like wants to be a product manager.
Of course.
And it was like a very attractive role, but realized that that was not really things that like excited me. The other thing as well is like I often think about like the RACI matrix, like accountability, responsibility, input, decision making. Like it's a rapid framework. And I think the thing I didn't like about product management is like you are accountable for things, but not the person responsible for it. So at the end of the day, it's the engineers who are building the product, and you'd be accountable for it, but like, you'd need to like influence the sales team to like sell it, marketing to like promote it, like engineers like build it a certain way. And I wanted to be in a role where I had both the accountability and the responsibility, where I could feel like I could have ownership and really be able to direct the course of like my success, if that makes sense.
No, makes a ton of sense. So okay.
I think the other thing as well about that is I think at that point in time I had conviction that support was an area that most people did not want to spend time in, but actually that there were a lot of problems, and there was like a lot of opportunity in that space, and there was not very good tooling and products that was like built in that area. So in some ways, I guess it's like manifested itself into like this opportunity with Assembled, because I think the time that I spent with Stripe support team gave me the expertise to then come into Assembled and move to a different function. Like I've never done sales or like account management before, but at least I understand how support teams work and operate, and can use that knowledge, and then figure out how to sell and how to manage customers after that.
Definitely. So that's a great transition note there. I guess getting away a little bit from Stripe and kind of going on to Assembled. Some of the questions coming in the chat here are, ultimately, what was your decision-making process about deciding to join Assembled? There's a lot of people in here that are maybe thinking about a career transition, either from a big company, small company, vice versa. So, please get as nitty-gritty as you can. What were you thinking as you were going through that?
Yeah, so one was definitely just the team. So Brian, so like Assembled has like 3 founders. So it's like Brian, who was the one who hired me into Stripe BizOps. Ryan, not to be confused with Brian, like just R. Ryan was one of the engineers, and he worked with Brian back at Stripe to build like internal tools for Stripe support team, because they knew they wanted to like start a company and they wanted to like test it out. So I had worked with the 2 of them actually for like a few months on the internal tool that they built for Stripe's support team. So for me, it definitely helped that like I had worked with 2 out of the 3 founders before. So there was already a lot of trust that was like implicit there. So that helped me out in thinking about joining them in the early stages of the company. 2 was, I think I always had FOMO around joining Stripe like a little bit later. Like I remember joining feeling really jealous of all the early employees. Like you hear there's, I mean, I don't know if like if folks here work at like startups, and like every time you join, you hear about the stories of like the early days. And I remember feeling a lot of FOMO about it and wanted to scratch that itch myself of like really seeing from the beginning, what does a startup look like, all the way through to it, hopefully scaling and like growing. And then 3 is, I think, the opportunity that was presented, where I was like thinking about my next steps after Stripe. Like I had gained some like management experience, but then I wanted to move to a role where I had more like accountability versus being in an enabler function. I think like when you're in a team that's like sales ops or support ops, at the end of the day, how you're evaluated is like, did you complete the project or not? And did you like help those teams? But you're not the person who's like, all right, actually I hit the sales targets or whatnot. And I wanted to be in a role that had like accountability for a specific metric. And that was the opportunity that was presented, which is like, be our first business person, help us figure out sales and like customer success. And there's always like the opportunity for like, if the company does better, that creates a pathway for you to step into a leadership role within the startup.
Yeah, that's a great decision or framework there between kind of enablers and doers, and basically which side of that do you want to be on. Okay, so that's all the positive side. What about the flip side? What were the hesitations about joining a super early stage, seed stage startup?
Yeah, hesitation is definitely, I guess, impact on work-life balance. I think when you work for a company that's like more built out, and as you have more employees, you can, when you take vacation, you can actually really like unplug and like not check things and know that things aren't going to break and the company will run just fine. But I'd say at the early stages, you're not quite at that stage yet, where every single person really does have that direct impact. And if you're like out for a bit, everyone else will feel it. That's not to say that you shouldn't take vacation and like, unplug, but like,
if you're 1 out of 5 versus 1 out of 100, it's a big difference.
Yeah. So I think definitely recalibrating and thinking through how much more time I had in like my personal life, or hobbies and all of the other personal interests that I had outside of work. I think obviously the other downsides is, most startups fail, and it's very possible that you join and then it doesn't succeed, or it doesn't take off as much. And then you have to think through opportunity cost on like learning, on like salary, on like progression, etc.
Got it. Okay, and there's one other question that came in here.
Oh, I think, and the other, I think maybe downside to it is, I think working in a very small team presents its own like different dynamics, and I think there will be a lot more like it just feels a lot more intense. Like the times when like things are great, it's like amazing, but then obviously times when you have maybe conflict, which I think is like a very natural phase in like a startup, can also like be pretty rough and has like a stronger impact, I'd say, on your personal life.
Yeah, higher highs and lower lows. So one of the other questions that came in was, so you obviously knew Brian and Ryan pretty well, it sounds like. Beyond that, was there any sort of diligence that went into your process of saying like, I think that this is a big market and, et cetera, et cetera?
If I was honest,
please.
really.
that's totally fine.
I wish I did. And I think I actually learned a lot more about like what I would like look out for after joining such an early stage startup. Like I think, and I guess I was like really naive, like having only worked at Stripe, I just like thought all startups will follow that trajectory. But like after I left Stripe, just realized how much of a once in a generation type company Stripe is, and like not every company, like most companies are not going to go through that kind of like growth that Stripe had. So I think definitely having a better sense, like now I have a better sense of like, oh, here's what it really means and feels like when you're at a seed stage or like at a Series A company versus like a Series C company. And then I think like having talked to more people and realized that like, oh, people actually like look at things, like they think about like the market and like the potential. And I guess in my case, I had like a lot of conviction in the founders and also in this space, and believe that like if we had the best team that we could like succeed. And I think like when I think about the choices I've made in my career, I've always just kind of like placed bets on people, because I feel like the market would crash. Like who would have known something like coronavirus would like have hit. But like I do think the relationships that you have with people are things that you can rely on a lot more, and I just had a lot more trust and faith in those relationships.
Awesome.
I don't know if that's the right way to think about it, but so far it's served me well so far.
Yeah. I mean, at the seed stage, that's kind of the bet. It seems to be working out so far. So, I guess you joined Assembled, you'd say kind of in a pre-product market fit. Maybe you guys had a customer or two customers. Curious on the kind of business side, what that process was like of helping that product market fit journey, and how things have maybe changed now that you maybe feel that you have it, and that's changed your day-to-day at all.
It's funny because like I think I joined Assembled. When I joined Assembled, I thought we found product market fit and we're already in the stage of like, yeah, we're gonna like scale and grow. And I think it's because Brian, like they did a great job of getting like their first few customers. They're all like amazing like logos. So they had like Stripe, GoFundMe, Looker and Slack were like just signed at like that point in time. So I was like, oh great. But it's like all these like companies want this. Like this is a product, it's gonna like take off. But I think I didn't realize how like when you're in a B2B SaaS company, it's not just like a self-serve machine that's just like gonna go. So like Stripe, I think, didn't have this problem of like needing to figure out demand. Like people just like naturally came to it. But I think the thing I had to learn was like, all right, how do you build more of like that demand for your product? So what are some of the marketing things, the efforts that you would need to do? And I think what was hard for me is like, there is no clear answer that like, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get this. Like, you just need to like test out different things and see what sticks. And like, I guess like you would call that a little bit like the white space, where it's like you can go in like any different direction. And I think actually that was like very hard for me. Like I think like where we're at now, where there's like a lot more momentum, like I think there's a lot more predictability in terms of like people like knowing us, like writing into us, we have a better understanding of our sales motion. This space feels a little bit better because there's like a bit more scaffolding and it becomes very clear, like, all right, here are the problems that we have and here are the things that we need to fix for us to grow, versus the earlier phases where it's kind of like, I guess the metaphor I would use, like you're trying to build a fire, but like you don't quite know what are the things that you need to do to like build it, versus like when you have momentum and there's that fire going, then you just like need to like react more to it.
And I realized at the beginning, I did not tell everybody what assembled is or what assembled does. So Jen, maybe, in your own words, you give a just quick, what is assembled for the group?
Yeah, we're building tools for customer support teams, and the specific area that we're tackling is this thing called workforce management. And what it does is it helps support teams forecast their support volume to like see, all right, how many phone calls, how many chats are coming, how many people do I need to staff? We help them schedule their team members to like make sure that they have sufficient coverage to actually be able to like, respond to customers like us when we're like asking questions to support, and then provide like analytics and like monitoring to like track like what's going on. Like the value of the tool is like it helps you in managing your costs, because when companies get bigger, you don't want your support costs to grow in line with your customer count. You want to have a way to manage the support headcount you have, and having a tool like Assembled helps you basically figure out how many people that you need and where to staff them at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess, on that too, given Assembled's focus on support teams, how do you see support or customer success, like its relative role within an organization? We've kind of talked about support ops and where something like that comes in. We've talked about the prestige roles of PMs. How do you see support playing into all of that?
Yeah, I'd say support. I think one of the trends that is changing is support is now becoming a key differentiator for a lot of companies and a lot of brands. Like I think if you think about D2C companies are a great like segment that we go after, because one of the things that they like really pride themselves on is like giving like really good support across different channels. So I think like support as a function plays like a bigger role in many companies right now. And I'd say the analogy I would make is back then, I'd say sales and marketing, they didn't really have very good metrics. Then things like Salesforce and Marketo came about, and then you're able to see like, oh, here's like the impact like these teams have on the company's growth. And I'd say what we're doing with like support is, I guess we're trying to like be the Salesforce for like support, which is like, how can we like do this to like help support teams really, hit their response times, or really deliver like amazing like support for their customers. Whereas I think before, these metrics tend to be very difficult for support teams to manage.
Yeah, I might say like making support success teams, first class citizen within an organization. Getting them a seat at the bigger tables.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well is like the other trend we see is, I think support tends to be a great feeder organization to other roles in like the companies. And like that's one of the core philosophies we have at Assembled, where workforce management tends to be a bit big brothery, and we're trying to find a way to make it like agent friendly. Like an agent is like a customer support representative, and part of the way that we've designed our product is we wanted to like provide transparency into like the metrics, into the agents, for them to feel like ownership over the performance metrics as well. So I think that's another thing that we're like thinking about, which is like, I like how you phrase it, Ryan, like support as a first class citizen, but also the customer support rep, who tends to be maybe the lowest person in like a support organization, making them a first class citizen, and actually finding ways to like find like the most talented folks there and help them like advance. Like a lot of our customers are buyers. Many of them started off as support agents, and then they like moved up the ranks, and they like love using Assembled.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, to be on my own soapbox, I've always kind of felt like support and success are very underrated, just in terms of they're usually closest to the client. They're getting the most raw feedback. They should be able to do more with that. So very cool. We have a question from Sophie. Sophie, I don't know if you're able to use your mic, but if you wanted to ask it, feel free. Otherwise, I can.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, quick question. So this is a dilemma. If you had to, so you have to choose one. Choice number one is you join like a, very high growth and impactful startup in a role that might not be your dream. But, obviously, it's solid. Choice number two, you join a startup in a market that's not as large, and the company is not experiencing explosive growth, but it's like the exact role that you want to do. Would love to hear your thoughts on how you would navigate that.
Do you think in hypothetical one, the role you would want could potentially arise because the company is growing so much?
Potentially.
I would then do one, because I think if the company is growing, then that means there are more problems to solve and the roles will become more interesting and you'll find more opportunities for what you might want. And two is like, I think you may think you want a certain role, but then until like you're in it, you don't quite know. So
Yeah.
I've always been a fan of preserving optionality. So like having a larger company and having those more opportunities fleshed out would be my approach.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Okay, we have some other questions in the chat. Jason, I saw you had a few good questions. I can go through and pick them out unless you want to ask them live.
Oh yeah, sure. I can. How about just the most recent one? Thanks a lot, Ryan, and thanks, Jen, for being here to do this. One question. I mean, I think I totally agree with what Ryan and you were saying, that support has been a second-class citizen, so to speak, in most organizations. It's viewed as more as like a cost center in my experience than a revenue generation center of sorts. So that's potentially an answer to my question. But the question is, why do you think Assembled or a solution like Assembled has not existed until Assembled was created? It seems like a very straightforward need in most businesses.
So solutions have existed. So I wouldn't say we're like creating the category of workforce management. This has actually been around for some time. And the earlier tools were created in a period of like call centers. So a lot of the legacy incumbent players were designed for like that environment. And it looks like Windows 95. They are not cloud-based and they're like on-premise solutions. And it's just like very clunky and was like fit more for like that environment. So I think one differentiator we have is like, we are built for like modern support teams. Like we understand how like the support team at like Casper or Harry's, like they're not staffing and managing their team the way like a call center in India would like manage their team. So we've like thought about like different functionalities that like a lot of these older players wouldn't have. Like for instance, things like SMS and social media are like now channels, and like we have different ways of like handling those things. We are API first because we know that modern support teams want to be able to connect the data here to like connect them with their own like data warehouses. So those are things I'd say the older players did not quite solve for in those situations. And then I think on the lower end of things, people also just like build their own solutions. So like the common thing we see people use before Assembled is actually using spreadsheets to like manage and organize the team schedules. But at some point when you have like 30 different people that you're doing this for, it becomes very, very time consuming and prone to a lot of errors.
Yeah, great. That makes a lot of sense. At my startup, we were doing something similar, like using spreadsheet solutions on our own to forecast demand and supply. Awesome. Thanks so much.
And Jason had another good question, which I'll steal here, but he asked, in addition to humility, how do you like to define SMART when looking for folks to work with? And I guess you could take that either way in terms of joining a team or hiring people as well.
Sorry, can you repeat that again? In addition to?
Yeah, so in addition to humility, which, one of the traits of Stripe, how do you define SMART when looking for folks to join to work with?
I'd say a mix of like intellectual curiosity and creativity is probably how I would like think about that. I think the intellectual curiosity manifests itself in like questions that are like asked, or other interests that people have. Like I think the best people are like the ones who like see many dots and like know how to like connect them and provide different like solutions. And then I'd say there's like different kinds of smart, right? But I'd say at like an early stage startup, I'd say creativity is a pretty important factor, because you're not going to have a lot of resourcing, yet you want to like make certain things come to fruition. And so it's more of a, all right, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to like find a way, like no matter what happens, like make this thing land. So I think that's where like a lot of creativity would come in.
Not to steal all the secrets, but do you have maybe one or two questions you might use in an interview to test for creativity? All good.
Well, we kind of like apply it more in like real life. So like we give like hypothetical scenarios and ask them what they would do in that situation. So we'll go through like with this guy's customers and we'll like say like, oh, like Opal is like this fintech company that like does XYZ, and like here's a situation that happened. What would you do? And then we'll try to like, yeah, back them into a corner to like say, all right, but this like happened. What would you do next?
Cool. Okay, I see there's a bunch of questions coming in. If anyone wants to unmute and just ask a question, go for it. Otherwise, I've got another one. A bunch of shy people. Okay, so I will kind of steal another question that someone else asked in here, which was this is just from what I know you at Assemble as well. So in your time at Assemble, you joined as first business hire, do a little bit of everything, and now you are kind of specializing, going in, focusing more on sales and support. Would be curious of what your decision process was to specialize that way, especially since you hadn't done those roles previously, like at Stripe, for example.
Like, so like why, what was like the decision or like the framework for like thinking about like why these specific areas?
Yeah, you can take it anyway, but that definitely works.
I think there's a part of me that always like wanted to see if I could like manage like large teams. And I think at the earliest stage of a company, you're either like building the product or selling the product. And so I feel like I wanted to get that experience doing sales and customer success, and really like have like that critical role in building the company's trajectory, because it really is like you're either doing one of like those two things, right? It doesn't mean that you're not doing any of the other stuff. I'd say at the stage that we're in, we're like 12 people. We don't even have a marketer yet. We're like hiring for one. So if you guys know anyone who like is interested in a marketing generalist role, we really need one. We don't have like partnerships people. We don't really have like a proper support team. We just like have business generalists right now that we're gonna like split our teams, like more people focusing more on like sales, which is like winning new customers, and then customer success, which is like everything post sales. But I'd say at the early stages, you're still doing a little bit of everything, because if those functions don't exist, you need to do something to make sure that you can kind of like drive towards the outcomes that you want. And I'd say thinking about like the functions to be responsible for at least helps me in prioritizing and focusing, which is like at the end of the day, my core job is making sure that we can hit our revenue targets and that we are bringing in this number of customers. But one thing I like learned is that you just like need to do whatever. You need to still zoom out and take a big picture and like take a step back and see what does the company need. So there's your core job, but then also thinking about like what are all the other things that's like needed to like help advance the business.
Bernard, I saw you tagged me in the chat. I think maybe, did you have a question earlier that you wanted to have a chance to ask?
Yeah, let me find it. Yeah, so, I heard at very early stages, there's like some people are saying like, oh, you have to focus on growth first and product market fit and stuff like that. And then they skip over the metrics tracking or not very rigorous about it. So like at what company stages do what categories of metrics become worthwhile? I don't know, it's not black and white. It's probably like some kind of progression as companies scale.
So is the question like what metrics are worth tracking at the early stages?
At various stages of companies' early growth.
I can tell you what we started tracking in 2020, and it's like nice like have a full year's worth of like data that we can then use to inform decisions moving forward. But just like getting a sense of like the drivers of the business, right? Which like if it's ultimately like in a SaaS business, it's like recurring revenue, then what is driving that is like price times number of customers. And then if you like go back up, it's like how do you get to customers? It's like, well, there's like people who like write in, there's like leads. Where are the sources of like those leads? So in our case, it would be like either inbound, meaning they wrote in via the website. There's like warm intros. We have a outbound, and then like what we call recycled, meaning they wrote into us before, but then they like came back later on. Then we like track through how long it took us to like close those deals, and then what was like our, and then from there you can then calculate various metrics, things like win rate, for instance. It's like I wish I could like whiteboard this, but when I was in consulting, they had this thing called like a driver tree before you had to like build a spreadsheet. Like you had to really think through like, all right, for like from the output, what are like the different drivers? So that was something I find helpful every time like I'm in a new place, which is like, all right, if the thing that matters is like revenue, let me work backwards and think about what are the different like levers that really make an impact on moving that, and focus on those things first, then start adding more like advanced metrics later on.
And actually, let's see. Does anyone else have any questions? Otherwise, I'll grab another one here. So when you and I last spoke, you'd mentioned that you were thinking of trying to write more, and you were thinking about writing kind of about the startup experience. I'd be kind of curious, what has been your biggest kind of surprise or learning so far while at Assembled? Maybe it's like how easy it is to get a huge customer as a small client or small company or something, but take it any way you like.
I spent a lot of time thinking about that question this morning, Ryan, and I think the one that is the most surprising is, it's not to say that you don't need to believe in the mission, but like I don't think like you need to be in like a situation where I'm like, oh my God, like this is the most like life-changing mission. And like that's why I'm like in the startup, where I think for a while I like grappled a lot with that. It's like, oh, but I'm like not necessarily like, changing the world. I'm like building enterprise software. Like, I'm not. And like I think the way I like reconciled with that is, do you believe you're building the best product in this space and like really solving an important problem that folks could like benefit from? And then I like think about like those people. So like we are pretty close with like the customers we have. So like I think a lot about like, did I make an improvement in like Shelton or like Harry's life? And that's kind of like how I make peace with it versus like the lofty mission, which I think was like slightly harder for me to like think about. It's like every day am I like, I'm so excited to like build the operating system for like customer support teams, or
No, phenomenal answer. And one of the other questions that came in is, what is the most interesting challenge for you right now at Assembled?
I don't know if it's like the most interesting challenge per se, but I mean, I think what's like top of mind is probably like hiring, just more of a, actually, I guess like maybe it is interesting in the sense of like, sometimes I feel like I'm the one who has to like push our founders to like say, if we want to grow this much, here's what we need to do. And I think that's like interesting from my like influencing like internally in terms of like, what is the plan? Like, I think sometimes you think it's coming from founders and like top down of like, we need to like grow. Whereas actually sometimes I think I'm like, we are not growing fast enough. Like you are not hiring enough engineers. And it's like, yet we want to like hit these targets. How are we gonna like do those things? So I think for me, it is interesting because I think through how you like influence folks and coming through what the right solution should be for the company. I guess it's like interesting because you're like an owner as well, but like you're not a founder, yet you were like there early-ish and like thinking through how you like influence them.
I guess just to bring things full circle, you get to use the legal skills now of convincing and arguing your case. So, okay, so we're getting close to 6. We have a couple questions. Laurel, do you want to ask your question that just came in here?
Sure. I wondered if you took time to develop a 100-day plan or an early plan when you started the company. Did you have a vision of what you saw the problems to be that were your own? And also, did you angle your career and think ahead to where you wanted to head with this role?
I thought about creating a 100-day plan. I didn't. I think mostly because coming in like my first week, I was just like, oh, this is what it's like to be in a 6-person startup. And I think to your point around like, to the earlier point I mentioned where there wasn't quite that fire yet and we were trying to figure out how to like fan the flames to it was like slightly harder for me versus like, I think if you come into an organization, it's like maybe 50 people, what are the things that are burning and it's just more like, all right, assess the situation. Here it's kind of like, what is our product? What is our target customer profile? There's a lot of like tossing things out to like see what sticks. So I didn't do that. And then what was your second question, Laurel?
Oh, just with regard to your own career and where you wanted to head, did you articulate that to yourself and say, these are the things I want to learn. This is why I took the job. And then once I get in, here's where I want to head.
In this case, I did. Although sometimes I think to my detriment, like I came in at the beginning, just like being fixated on like just wanting to focus on sales. So like the thing I was like saying earlier, right, which like you have like areas that you're like responsible for, but you should still like zoom out and see what the company needed. Like I think early on I was like saying like, oh, I don't really want to like do anything on like the marketing side. That's like marketing's problem, and like I'm just gonna leave that as a gaping hole so that they see that it's a problem and that they staff it. But then like realize that like you shouldn't do that at an early stage, and like what is most important is like how do you advance the business. And if what is needed is for me to do more marketing, then I will do more marketing, because you just like do whatever it like takes at that point in time.
Thank you.
Awesome question, Laurel. Thank you. Okay, so we're coming up on 7. A closing question would be, is there anything that you would like to ask of our community? Anything that's, top of mind, any, you mentioned marketing, hiring, whatever it might be.
I mean, I think I'd like love like any feedback on like this session, like what were the things that was like most enjoyable, and maybe what were some parts that were like, like a little bit more boring. I just like be curious.
Do your feedback forms, everyone. Ryan, Jen, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun, and thank you all for coming and asking great questions. It was really good to see everyone for our very first Operators You Should Know, and a lot more of this in the future. Thank you, guys.
This was great. Yep. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, nice meeting you all.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Have a great night.